Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to be here with you. And in this afternoon, in this second session, discussion between Policy Center for the New South and the Atlantic Council, in the occasion of our publication of our two reports based on external rivalries in Africa between major and other players. This second session, I'll have the pleasure to receive our famous partner, Professor Pierre Englebert, Professor of International Relations, Pomona College, Senior Fellow at African Center for Atlantic Council. Professor Rida Lyammouri, my colleague in the Policy Center for the New South, Senior Fellow, and Professor Abdul Salam Bello, Senior Project Officer, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and Senior Fellow for African Center, Atlantic Council. We'll discuss and we'll talk about Sahel issue and the problem raising there. I want to say something about that the situation is still very complicated until now in Sahel and Sahara. There is several agenda still in place and playing a major role, a lot of contradiction between local agendas and foreigner agenda. Also, we can remark that the political transition still suffering a lot in this region, and we'll hope that in Mali they will find a good solution and a good platform of discussion between the several political platform in this country. I think also that the issue of radicalism and terrorism became progressively more indigenous, and we can remark that we can, perhaps, I am not a specialist, Rida can correct me, but I can say that we are in front of a local model of terrorism, a local model of comportment with a local resource of thinking radicalism in this region, and the relation and the network between integrism, radicalist and integrist group. In that way, the relation between them and social group. If I don't want to talk about ethnical groups or tribe groups, I prefer this term, social groups. And also the relation with all the political forces in the area will complicate the situation more and more. Also, I am afraid about something that perhaps we have a few model and a few experience of democratization in the area. Means one of the most example that I consider one of the most important example who suffer a lot in the area, the example of Burkina Faso. I think that the question now is how can this process of democratization in a country like Burkina Faso or in any other country can successful in area with a lot of instability, with this rivalry between social groups, using their appartenance, their ethnical, their cultural appartenance in increasing in their political problem, and also their relation with radical groups. Well, in that way, I want to ask our professor and my colleague in the other side that to speak just a few minutes about and to have a more prospective approach than what does it mean that a historical approach. I think that we are trying now to looking for solution for how to be in a better way, in a better situation than what we can see now. First of all, I will give the floor to Professor Pierre Englebert. You have the floor, sir. I think 5, 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at least. Okay, you have the floor, Professor. Now I hear you.
I thank you very much. I would like to pass my turn and defer to my senior colleague Abdul Salam Bello to start before me. We coordinated a little bit earlier, and we think it might make a more seamless progression to go from his points to mine, if that's okay with you.
Okay, as you want. I, Professor Abdul Salam Bello, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Pierre, for passing the floor. Well, before I answer your specific question about the models, etc., I want just to set some stage and propose that we go further from there. First, thank you also for having me into this discussion, and congratulations for both Atlantic Council and Policy Center for the document you have worked on in relation to the Sahel. Well, let's dwell a little bit on some of the key issues, and they will provide answer to the question you have raised. First, the demography. The demography puts a lot of pressure on those countries, and especially in terms of needs to provide education, shelter. We are in the context of COVID, so health response, but also jobs. And this speaks also to two big issues the region is facing. One, the security issue, two, the migration issue. And just to put some figures there, coming from Niger, you take my country in 1950, actually, it was 10 times less populated than it is today. So the population grew from 2 million in 1950 to 20 million today, so 10 times. But of course, Niger is not the only country. If you take the median age in most of the Sahelian country, you will see that the median age actually is under 20. So therefore, you see the pressure in terms of access, needs access, and therefore the pressure on the institution and on the governments. But it's not the only dimension. We need to provide response, but you need to provide also a sustainable response. When we talk about job, you need also to provide sustainable job. And therefore, you need to have a more better dynamic economic system or even economic growth. The economic growth is good in the region in general. It's almost 2-digit in some cases, but they are driven by commodities. So we need to have an economy that is inclusive enough to yield also sustainable jobs. And to do that, you need industries. And to have industries, you need energy. Let's have a look at the energy access in the region. In a country like Chad, electrification rate in Chad is about 10-11%. In Burkina Faso, it's about 25%. In Mali or Mauritania, much better, 43%, but still it's remained a bit low. And here we're talking only about access. We don't talking about we're not talking about the cost, the stability of the network, etc., etc. And we're not even talking about the access in the rural area. In some countries, the access in the rural area is even below 1%. So those are some of the issues also that need to be tackled if we want really to address those issues in terms of security development. There are a lot of issues we can talk about, but I will just mention another one, which I believe is very important for the sake of this discussion, is the role of the state. Over the last years, what we have seen, the state's weakness is being compensated by other actors, non-traditional actors, which actually is helpful to provide services, of course, in some areas, but it's weakening paradox the role of the state and therefore the authority of the state, as we say in French, l'autorité de l'État. And this also speaks to what? To the state capabilities. There is very interesting stats from the OECD and done with UMOA, the Economic Monetary Union for West African countries that covers also Sahel. If you take the ratio that speaks to the number of civil servants per 1,000 inhabitants, you will see that actually the Sahel countries, most of them, not to say all, they reach just about less than 10 civil servants per 1,000 inhabitants. Less than 10 civil servants per 1,000 inhabitants. In some countries, like my country, it's even below 5. So therefore, you can wonder how would you be able to provide really services in countries where the space, the superficie is that big. Niger is 2 times the size of France, for instance. But if you want to put some perspective there, you take Norway, you have 160 civil servants per 1,000 inhabitants. In the US, it's about 70. So, and here we're talking only about the quantity, not even the quality, nor even the spatial distribution, meaning urban, rural distribution, or even specific areas, let's say the distance from the capital city or the borders. And most of the issues we're talking, or we'll be talking about also speaks to border issues. So just to sum up, those are some of the elements I wanted to flag here. Meanwhile, solutions, actors, I guess we'll get back to it. So, but 2-3 elements I think we need to focus around is how to make a more coordinated response. And so far, when you look at the region, each partner comes with his, her own flag. And sometimes you see conflicts in agenda, and linking that to the capability of the states, it becomes also difficult for the state to make or enforce coordination among those partnerships, especially when it speaks to the military fight against terrorism, even for sometimes what is the definition of terrorism. So sometimes we fall into very gray area. We spoke about the COVID and those challenges, how to build back better, I would say. Those are some elements we may need to think about. What will be the role of the multilateral development institutions, the World Bank, African Development Bank, even the G5 Sahel, for instance. I think there will need also in the coordination of those efforts on those response to give also more strength to those structures to come with a more coordinated platform. Last but not least, I don't want to monopolize the floor here. I think one dimension is also, we've been talking about the bilateral. We need also, when even the bilaterals, the USA or others, are dealing with those issues in the region, they also not lose the sight of the regional dimension. Most of the issues that are happening in, let's say, one of the countries, they have spillover effect in the neighboring countries by movement of people, meaning refugees, or even by transposition of insecurity. Some use other countries as shelter to provide, to do some attacks in the neighboring country and get back to that. So we need really to go beyond, I will say, this pure bilateral approach and have something really more integrated and inclusive, which speaks also to how the dialogue going forward with the countries will evolve. I will stop here. I hope I didn't extend 7-8 minutes.
Well, thank you, Professor Abdul Salam. Well, I'll have some questions, but after giving the floor to Professor Englebert and Rida Lyammouri. Professor Englebert, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you so much. And I also want to extend my congratulations to the Policy Center of the New South and the Atlantic Council for these 2 reports that are absolutely fantastic and so useful. And I will assign them in my classes next semester. I really encourage everybody who's watching us to read them. I want to start on the theme from Abdul and expand on it. And essentially is the notion of you mentioned capabilities, administrative capabilities. And I think at the very core of the Sahelian crisis is a structural weakness of states. The Sahelian states are fundamentally weak as examples of states. Of course, they have low population density despite the demographic growth. Those are huge states, And statehood benefits from density. And so when you have a very large territory with a scattered population, it's not easy to project power. It's not easy to organize administration. But they also have very weak extractive capacity. A state is essentially an institution that lives off an economic surplus, right? You have to be able to produce enough, and then you kind of organize collective action. But African Sahelian states have a very, very weak capacity to extract resources. If you look at the amount of taxation that comes out at the national level, in Mali, it's $130 per person that the state is able to extract in taxes and fees and different similar extractive measures. In Niger, it's $108. In Burkina Faso, it's 58. Right? Compare that to France, where it's $21,000 per citizen. So this notion that we can have this Weberian state model, that somehow the states like Mali, Burkina, Niger, really the core of the Sahel there, the idea that these states can somehow emulate this sovereign territorial state model imported from Europe is really a fallacy that we have to move away from if we want to address the real fundamental problems. We can speak of development, but this notion that they will ever become that kind of state is not realistic, and it's not helpful to be stuck with that. So I want to start from that, because you can't explain the violence and the current problem if you don't really problematize the very existence and the very nature of Sahelian states. Then my second point would be that there's a tremendous disconnect in these countries between the political elites and the security situation and the lived situation, the people on the ground, particularly in the regions that are exposed to terror. There was a coup in Mali in August, and this really brings us back to old style politics from before the big democratization of the 1990s. And that coup is really largely a corporatist coup that, the military, there was a frustration with the Ibeka regime, and that's legitimate. But at the same time, it didn't really address the fundamental issues. It's more about protection of the interest of the military and takeover of the government instead of doing significant fighting in the field. You had elections in Burkina, and I celebrate the elections and the democracy. But at the same time, the president was reconducted in office, and his party, the MPP, retained almost a majority. And if you look at the results in the north, where there's significant violence, in the east, the results of the ruling party are almost not very different from before. Now, it makes you question, are elections a proper way then to communicate popular aspirations in this kind of environment when there doesn't seem to be kind of a institutional or electoral response to the crisis? So it gives you the idea that these institutions are somehow disconnected and are not the natural ways whereby people want to express their political preferences. And so I think that the reproduction of these mechanisms of these states essentially encourages a distanciation, an alienation between the state and population. Look at Mali. Recently, there was a strike by the big Malian union, complaining about the lack of benefits for workers, the lack of compensation for all the events. Now, I don't blame these people for taking care of their welfare. But at the same time, those are already political elites that benefit from a better situation than their fellows, in rural areas. And so it suggests the fact that people in Bamako, people in Ouagadougou, in Niamey are living a certain degree of disconnect from the reality of their countries and making demands that are not really always matching the capabilities and the aspiration. And then you look at Niger. There was a huge corruption scandal in the military this past year. So you have continued elites that essentially live off the state, instrumentalize the state, turn the state into a resource, a material resource, at the expense of its building of capabilities. And this problem is spreading south, right? I mean, I think that when you look at Guinea and President Alpha Conde's willingness to kind of, violate his own constitution, if you will, to stay a third term. You look at Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire. Those are elites that essentially are getting settled in the state and reproducing their control of the state without addressing the significant issues of aspirations of youth, of letting others access into these institutions. And when you continue to kind of monopolize these institutions, at some point, you have these pent-up grievances that feed into the contestation and the violence. And so it's not a surprise when you see that the jihadist threats are spreading to Benin, are spreading to northern Côte d'Ivoire, etc. So these Gulf of Guinea states are vulnerable too, and they are on the same kind of spectrum, if you will, as the Sahelian ones, although less vulnerable in the short run. So what I would say then in terms of implication is that the focus that we have right now as outsiders on combating, using military intervention to combat a jihadist, that's really band-aid kind of solution, but it doesn't address the real problems, and it's not going to solve the real problems. First of all, the military effort is mismatched. When you look at Barkhane, the French operation in the Sahel, Barkhane is not there for Mali. Barkhane is not there for Burkina or Niger, for those states. Barkhane is there for the French. And I don't blame them, but at the same time, you have to understand Barkhane is fighting jihadists in the region because it's a front line between in a war between France and these groups. And it happens to be in the soft underbelly of the French neo-imperial system, if you will. But Barkhane is not there to help rebuild Mali. Mali might benefit, right, the coattails of that intervention to a degree, but it's not about state reconstruction, right? And so the US, United States has drones in Niger, drone base in Burkina. Again, those are not there necessarily for Niger or Burkina Faso. So these interventions that are fighting a specific threat are not there in support of the victims of that threat in a very direct sense, if you will, right? MINUSMA itself, which is clearly there to a degree for Mali, is focused on the wrong conflict, if you will. It's like, it might have been relevant 5 years ago, but things have changed tremendously. And MINUSMA is, of course, highly inefficient, protecting itself a lot. The consequence of these interventions of things like Barkhane and MINUSMA is that they exonerate the African elites, they exonerate the Malian elites, they exonerate the elites in Burkina, because they give them a veneer of protection, if you will. And so therefore, these groups are allowed to kind of indulge in politics that's somewhat disconnected from the reality of their population because they are protected from the potential sanctions of their mismanagement. So, when we think of, like, the United States has been talking about a drawdown of its forces, that's not necessarily unproblematic, but it's not necessarily bad news per se. I think it might help us refocus in other ways. What I would suggest in the short run is that the focus has to be on African militaries. There is a capacity shortage, but instead of deploying troops from, the European Union, from France, from the US, I think there has to be a transfer of resource to African militaries, and African militaries have to do the fighting. And if they want to do the fighting, they have to live with the state consequence of that. States are institutions that project power and monopolize violence. And if they cannot do that, there's a fundamental problem that the Sahelian populations have to come to terms with. So in the short run, I think that what we need to focus on is giving the means to these African militaries to do more of the fighting and to take responsibility. And then I think in a broader sense, we have to stop this Weberian fallacy that Sahelian states can one day become, France in the Sahel, right? What we need here, I think, is a solution that's regional. And I'm not just talking about something like the G5, some sort of collaboration. I'm talking about some potential dilution of Sahelian states into some broader entity where there could be free movement of people, where there could be a better allocation of scarce resources. Something that kind of harks back to the pre-colonial days when you did have quasi-imperial structures that had very large degree of local autonomies and a very light institutional footprint, which fits well the type of resource environment that we have. If you look at, and I'll finish with this, but look at the relationship between people and the states, the level of trust is very low in the states. So for example, in Mali, recent data showed that 47% of the Malians trust the president and 37% trust the National Assembly. In contrast, 87% trust traditional chiefs, 78% trust religious leaders. So you have institutions, I'm sorry, my light went off, hold on. Sorry about that. This is, we're trying to save resources. So if you think of that, those institutions, the chiefs, the religious leaders, there is a dense network of potential substitutes to the state, or potential complements to the state that is largely neglected, and that the states could build upon instead of kind of, as Abdul was saying, they kind of on the side and they weaken the state, but the state could build upon those. So I believe that we need some sort of broader notion of state in the Sahel that goes beyond the existing sovereign states and also below the state by building on institutions that exist at the local level and that have legitimacy. You look at Imam Haidara, for example, in Mali, a big Sufi imam. He's at the head of a tremendous network of welfare organizations. Those can be integrated. And so, this is a very broad agenda, but I think in the long run, that's where the Sahel has to go if it has a chance to go beyond the current crisis. And in the short run, the Sahelian militaries have to step up. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Englebert. And now I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Rida Lyammouri. You have the floor.
Thank you, Monsieur Chegraoui. Thank you for the invite, and it's great to be here with you. And yeah, I will just go back to your question about speaking how localized the issues are in the Sahel. Even that we see that the conflict that's one example. The other example for the focus on migration issues, the idea of that people will flee the region because there are ongoing violent conflicts. It's totally wrong. People do not flee ongoing violence to reach Europe, cross the Mediterranean, but rather they leave to seek security, safety, and where they can have access to aid, where they can have access to basic public services. And if we see like the high number of internally displaced population right now that exceeded 1 million in Burkina Faso alone, that's one of the worst humanitarian crises in the continent, if not in the world. So, and because as we have seen, not totally the failure, but the dragging along of counterterrorism operations in the region, violent extremist organizations continue to flourish, continue to expand, and also threaten neighboring countries even further south to coastal states. We are seeing indications of their presence now in northern Benin, northwest Nigeria with the recent incidents, even if it's not a direct relationship, but Boko Haram have claimed responsibility of the kidnapping of 500 plus young students to send a message to a local government, but also to the international community. And what does that do is that creates this unimaginable propaganda in their, and they can go further, they can exploit to recruit and gain popularity in the country and in the region. In addition to Boko Haram, and we can go into the details about also the expansion of the Islamic State in Greater Sahara and West Africa province in the area. And because the solutions that the international community came up with have struggled, we are seeing right now more local populations, local communities are taking the matters into their own hands in areas where violent extremist organizations are present. And just as Mr. Pierre mentioned, traditional leaders, religious leaders, they are negotiating with whoever the actor is present there, legitimate or illegitimate. They are seeking support, not necessarily support, but a way of how they coexist peacefully, because the initiatives on counterterrorism have failed to address the issues as fast as was expected, and the situation continues to get worse. There is a tracking record of GNM now achieving peace deals and reaching peace deals with local communities in central Mali. There have been attempts to do the same thing across the border in Burkina Faso. It has not been as successful so far, but there have been attempts. This also have been reaching some parts of northern Mali in the Gao region on the borders with Niger and Burkina Faso. So local population, local communities are taking the matters into their own hands because the states, regional partners, and international partners have failed so far to help them and to deliver first the protection they need in terms of security, and then in terms of public services delivery. I mentioned security because we dozens, if not hundreds, of local leaders and civil servants that are representing the states have been directly targeted by violent extremist organizations because they either collaborate with the state and the state, or either with the central government or with the international forces, either the UN or with MINUSMA in Mali or with the Barkhane forces or with the security forces. So they have been directly targeted, and all the actors involved, national, regional, international, failed to protect them. And these actors, the states relied on them to deliver public services that the state's supposed to deliver. They are the one providing that governance that central government does not have. As Mr. Abdul mentioned, they don't have the resources and the capacity to govern the enormous space, geographical space they have in their countries. The Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, they're vast, large countries, so they don't have the resources to provide public services and govern all the space they have. So they relied on those local traditional authorities to do that for them. But since their influence are disappearing, then the state is also disappearing and also continues to lose that legitimacy among local communities. And the local communities, therefore, are looking for alternatives on how they could live peacefully and they could continue to exist either through talking with legitimate or illegitimate actors. But they are right now in the mode of survival. And I will stop here and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Rida. We had received such a question about several issues linking to the region of Sahel. Well, I'll choose some of them who be, for me, just I will make a choice because I cannot read all the question. Well, this is the first one. How has the management of the Sahelian crisis involved in the context of multiple external intervention, regional rivalries, and local political and institutional weakness? I will add something also. What about the returning of Russia, the presence of China, and how about the future of Biden administration in this area? I think that Professor Englebert or Billu can answer to this question. Who want to take off the floor?
Abdul, go ahead.
Okay, yes. Regarding the external powers, the role of the Biden administration. Well, definitely we have seen some players coming back after having left the region for some time, speaking about Russia, for instance. And we see that it's not about this Sahel, the 5 countries in the Sahel only, but Russia's involvement also speaks to what is happening in Central Africa Republic, for instance. So you see that it's also not only a Sahelian strategy, but I will say a more larger strategy when it comes to Africa. And Russia opened an embassy recently in Mali, covering most of those Sahelian countries. We may need to see the direction going forward Russia is taking in the region, knowing that last year there was this summit in Sochi as well, where also there's some discussion on how Russia can also support some opportunity for development economics. I think there have been some discussion for railway, for linking some of the countries through finance. Most maybe I would say it's a discussion might be ongoing on with Russia in that context. Regarding China, China is, I would say, an old player in the region. I would say almost since the independences, and depending on countries like Mali, they've had also very close ties, not only with Russia during previous regime, but also with China. But regarding China, what I can say here is in the mid 90s, you see that there was a competition between China and Taiwan, where actually Taiwanese have been able to secure stronger political partnership with Taiwan. That's created tension between some of those countries and the Republic of China. And in the early 2000s, we see China coming back very stronger in terms of investments, economic investments. For instance, in the mine industry, oil and gas mining industry in some of the countries. I can mention also what's happening in Niger with a long pipeline that is being financed by Chinese currently. Beyond that, also, you see China also investing or providing a lot of support in terms of capacity building, training, scholarship for the students, for them to go and study in China. And this also, like I was saying, for Russia, is not only in the context of Sahel, but it's part of a much larger, I will say, strategy of China in Africa per se. If you look at the FOCAC, which is a platform that links Africa and China, it's one of the most attended head of state event, attended by almost all African head of state, including Sahelian ones. So definitely then, if you take it in the context of a competition, yes, there is a competition. There is a very stiff competition, but we need also to put ourselves in the feet of, I would say, those countries. And in my introduction, I was outlining most of those challenges. Those challenges also are putting a lot of pressure on those governments to deliver. And efficiency, effectiveness of those partnerships will become more and more critical on the way the countries will design or partner with external actors. So we also need to have this in mind, knowing that we are no longer in the old approach of international cooperation, where you have a recipient on one hand and a donor on the other hand. Still, this scheme still is there, but the recipient or the Sahel countries are becoming also more aggressive, knowing exactly what they want and knowing exactly what they do not want. So this will also trigger future action activities with various partners. Regarding the Biden administration, I think the presence of the US, we have seen some kind of disengagement over the recent years, even if the US also appointed a special envoy for the Sahel. But we see also some of the initiative that may need to be strengthened or scaled up, but it speaks to the bilateral approach between the US government and those countries. But definitely some areas I will really, I think for Biden administration is important to consider is a longer term approach in this dialogue with the countries. And when I say longer term, is supporting really strengthening the state's capacities, capabilities, as we mentioned on one hand, but also opportunities for unleashing the potential for the private sector and more inclusive economy. And here also, I think the energy dimension and the technology remain also critical, especially more investment in the rural area, because that's where you have the majority of the population. And then supporting or sharing lessons, platform regarding how you address the governance of the natural resources. Rida was talking about the conflict in among various cultural groups. This is where also that we believe that there might be some opportunities going forward.
Okay, thank you. There is another question linked to the external presence and external rivalries in Africa about France. Can France be able to stay playing the main role as a main player, a main actor in this region against a lot of critics rising from society there, and also beside this ambivalence and critical situation about government there, who are asked all the time by French government to take a decision and to say yes or no? I think, well, perhaps Rida or Engelbert.
Yeah, I'll be glad to start with that. You know, and I can add a few things that I wanted to follow up from Abdul, but I think that France has to look for an exit strategy. It's not sustainable for France either. This is a very costly operation, 5,000 troops now out there. And you know, even though they do have some kinetic success and you know, they strike certain actors, that's kind of containment, right? That's really military containment. It doesn't not really address the source of it. And certainly the capacity of these groups to renew and to reproduce themselves is maybe, if anything, encouraged by the presence of that enemy on the ground, right? And as you were saying, Khalid, the big problem is that the local buy-in, right? I mean, it was just last year or earlier this year, I guess, that Macron had everybody in Pau, the main leaders of the Sahel, and essentially telling them, you know, stop going after us, because you had, you know, ministers in Burkina, you had people in different countries complaining about how, you know, listen, we believe the French could do it if they wanted to, so they're not really there to help us. So you do have a strong degree of mistrust between some of these African elites and the French, which is not sustainable either, right? And then it's very costly. So I do think the French are to come, you know, recently there was just a scandal, I think it was yesterday, or whether that the French military, or at least actors associated with the French military, were behind some Facebook groups that were trying to build like fake pages that were building support, trying to make people feel better about the French intervention. So if you have to resort to these Russian tactics to kind of change public opinion, you know that you're kind of on shaky ground there. I wanted to quickly say something about the Biden administration. I think this is a great time, right? I mean, to some extent, this is a good time to, and I would say, you know, build upon the disengagement from this current administration. And I think that switch focus on providing resource for African militaries instead of deploying more U.S. troops. At some point, a couple of years ago, the U.S. had 800 troops in Niger. I mean, why is that? There's a significant presence there. Do you think anything good will come out of that for Niger? I don't think so. Look at Afghanistan. It hasn't really helped to have that, you know, I don't see any kind of genuine solution for these countries from this kind of presence. So I think that there's something beneficial to think about pulling out and think about participating in different ways that give ownership and agency to African states, and also give them responsibilities, right? And I would like to add a tiny little thing. It's not only an outside actors, but I would like to think about the North African actors and their role. And both Morocco and Algeria are very, very significant actors in the Sahel. And Algeria has been largely at the root of the problems. You know, the jihadists in the Sahel are people originally who come from Algeria pushing its own jihadist problem to the south, and that's spreading into different conflicts down the road. But Algeria has tried to facilitate some mediation, but also is at the root of some of the problems. Morocco has, of course, a significant historical influence in the region, and has also strong religious leadership for many people there. And I think there is room to think of the solution, not just in Sahelian terms, but in trans-Saharan terms, bringing Morocco and Algeria more into the equation of the future institutional outcome.
Yeah, I think so. I am agree with you, Englebert, and also perhaps I can say something about the renewal or rethinking the regional groups in Africa totally. Mean that talking about North Africa itself, outside Western Africa or Sahara, I think it's something that we can see in other way, and to make more link and to return to some historical network who successful for several centuries before. But the border now between country in the north and in the west, and in all African countries, I think that they added more complexity and more problem than resolve some issue of this situation. Well, I have also another question, perhaps for Rida. I think that he can answer more well. How could the new situation caused by the pandemic offer the terrorist groups opportunities due on the one hand to the symbolic burden of the pandemic explained as divine punishment, on the other hand to increase vulnerability of the populations?
Thank you for the question. And very, very quickly, if we talk about this specifically about the Sahel, I stand by a point that I made before in the previous publication, is that violent extremist organizations have not benefited from the pandemic. There is no direct correlation between the pandemic increased or decrease of violence in the Sahel. As a matter of fact, if we see the pre-pandemic period, there were the amount and number of violence in the Sahel was higher than when the pandemic started in early 2020. So there is no credible data to show that direct correlation. In addition, that where these groups operate in rural communities, those communities are struggling to even believe that there is a pandemic. And also they have more other concerns other than the pandemic. They're concerned about other health issues such as the malaria, etc. Access to basic health services. So I think it's a distraction to think that VEOs, that the extremist groups are benefiting and using the pandemic. I would say the pandemic may have affected humanitarian operations to assist populations that are suffering from extremist organizations' violence, but I would not say that directly there is that extremists are benefiting. If I might very quickly, in the previous questions, first, the issue of disinformation campaigns between Russia and France. Competition between external actors, it's really disruptive, and who is the victim? Again, locals are the victims, because they are the ones that continue to suffer from the outcome of this competition between external actors. So I think, and it's I would say I go to the point that it's really embarrassing to France that the military was engaged. Were engaged in this disinformation campaign with fake accounts and fake news on Facebook, that they brought themselves to the level of Russia that we know have been engaged in several in similar acts such as in Libya. So I think that we should back off a little bit. I think France should step away from that tactic. The second point, what France should maybe think about it. And I think Alex Thorsten, who is a colleague of mine here in DC, talked about it. I think France should give some space to local governments to figure out their own local problems, such as in recent months, we have seen increasingly the debate about negotiating with extremist groups. And this has been going on for several months, maybe over a year. And I think France should create some space for the Malian government to decide if they want to negotiate and who they want to negotiate with. Totally understandable that how could you negotiate with the terrorists who are the French are fighting against, but I'm sure there is a way that could give more results and more stability to the region. The second point about increased international actors in the region, for anyone who travels frequently, you can see the increased presence of Russia, as well as Turkey, for example, in Niger. In the last couple of years, they struck a few economic development deals. They rebuilt and remodeled the new airport. They are in charge of managing it. Additionally, they built one of the fanciest hotel in the region. They're also in charge of managing it in exchange with the Nigerian government for other deals, but also Turkey are seeking more security collaboration with Niger. So there is no denial. But I think one point that we should be thinking of is the long-term game. Russian companies working on the agriculture sector have engaged as recent as the Sochi summit in competition with African actors as well to compete in the agriculture sector. Other markets are saturated, so Russian companies are looking for alternatives, and Africa offers that ideal alternative. Food security is a main issue in the continent, and even one of the sometimes a key driver to ongoing conflicts. So I think access to agriculture and food security in the Sahel and the continent in general is going to be something that's going to evolve in coming months and coming years about Russia. I will stop here.
Well, thank you, Rida. I have a question linked to what you have said just now. What governance of Sahelian state? How to understand the development, security nexus for external power engagement in the region? I think that you answer in a few words to this question. But beside this question, I have another question linked to the external actor. How do you analyze the AU's task force, Takuba, now being deployed in Mali? An improvement, or do we expect that it will face the same problems? First question, nexus development and security with the external forces, and the second one about the Takuba force. In honor of you.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, if I might jump in very quickly here, I think the issue of security is apparent, and for development to return and for governance. And I think we need security efforts, well-thought security efforts that could create the space for non-security initiatives to return, for governance issues, to address governance issues and development. As I mentioned earlier, how would the central government would govern some space where all its representatives are not there? They all either fled the area or they have been assassinated. So they are not in contact with direct contact with the local population and the people that they're supposed to assist. So first, there is that extreme need. There is that need for security. The space needs to be secured for governance and development to return. There is a need for both. That's how I see the relationship between development and security. As for the Special Forces Task Force, the Takuba, it might have some results in the short term, and it's going to be more of what we call chirurgical operations, and targets very specific, maybe key leaders, units of extremist groups operating in the region. But I will say the results will still be limited and will not resolve the problem. This has been taking place since Serval and then Barkhan started 2013 and then 2014. These groups demonstrated that they could replace key leaders, they could replace fighters being targeted or arrested. So the results will remain limited, and maybe it's too early to say, but that's how I see it. I see that it might record some success, that France and its partners in this task force will be celebrating and to show results to local, regional governments and to the international community. But in terms of concrete results on the ground, it remains to be seen.
Thank you, Rida. Is there someone want to add something? Yeah, Mr. Englebert.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. I agree, and I think that what comes out is that Takuba is really helping the French more than it's helping the Sahel. And I think that Takuba comes out of this desire for the French to share the burden with other European countries and for other European countries to show some solidarity with France in the region. But I don't know that it will make a significant difference in terms of improving the security situation in the region. The European Union has a better program with the EUTM, the training mission that they have in Koulikoro, about 50 kilometers north of Bamako. But even there, this notion of training is somewhat paternalistic. You know, the African militaries are well trained too, and they can fight if they need to. I think a more direct transfer of resources to help the African troops do their business would be just like cash transfers in development would be kind of a better way to acknowledge the local agency. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think Takuba is really more for the French than for the Africans.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Engelbert. We'll have 2 minutes, perhaps a small question and small answer. Perhaps for Mr. Bello, I will give him the last floor and the last word. Well, what about the regional actor, AU, African Union, ECOWAS, and other? But beside the influence of external actors, can they let them do their work, like what's happened with ECOWAS at the beginning of the Mali crisis and what's happening now?
Well, I think
in 1 minute or two maximum.
Okay. Well, this is a difficult question in 2 minutes, but my answer will lead to what Pierre and Rida were talking about the militaries. I think at the end of the day, it is the need for clear coordination, division of labor among those actors. What we see now, and even the question leads to this rational thinking that the more actors you bring, maybe the more solution you will find. But I think it's the contrary. The more actors you bring, the more complexity actually you add, and the less efficiency you will bring in that process. And we see that in the civil side approach, we see that in the military side approach. So to come back to the question, regional actors, definitely the African Union is playing also a role, especially and the ECOWAS. We have seen that in the context of the coup that happened in August in Mali. I think they have a role in terms of supporting or promoting, at least to some extent, the rule of law in the region and respect for some institution. But those institutions also, we have to be frank, they have also their own weaknesses. So their role, I will say, is important, is in helping also creating the necessary framework, provided that themselves have the necessary ways and means and capabilities to enforce or to influence the coordination in the region on one hand, but also to support the countries lay out the ground or implement any strategy that will be designed at this regional level. So far, I think we are still waiting to see more results in the ground. So I would say regarding the roles, I would say politically it is important, but I believe that we need to do much more and to be more aggressive in that context.
Thank you, professors. We come to the end of this session. Thank you, Mr. Englebert. Thank you, Mr. Bello. Thank you, Mr. Lyammouri, for assisting us and for this very interesting session. Thank you to all our colleagues and friends in Atlantic Council and PCNS, friends IT here in PCNS, done a very good job. Hope to continue our collaboration between our two institutions and hope to see you physically and to make more sociability between us. I think we need to take plans sometimes and to see friends in reality. I hope to see you here in Morocco or to see you in Washington next time. Goodbye. Thank you very much, all of you. Bye.
Thank you.